Tonight we're in Bristol, and welcome to Question Time. Good evening to you at home and to all our audience here who are going to be putting questions to our panel, who, as ever, don't know the questions that are going to be put. Our panel tonight: the Liberal Democrat Business Secretary, Vince Cable; Labour's former Northern Ireland Secretary, Peter Hain; the feminist campaigner and Guardian columnist, Julie Bindel; the author, former fund manager and Conservative MP, Kwasi Kwarteng; and the associate editor of the Sunday Times, Camilla Cavendish. So, our first question tonight from Anthony Ward, please.
Has the sale of Royal Mail been a first-class disaster for the taxpayer?
The sale of Royal Mail, whose shares are now worth 67% more than when they were launched shortly ago. Peter Hain, has this been a first-class disaster for the taxpayer?
Yes. It's not only been a disaster, it's been a total scandal. Because what the government has done is nationalise the debt of the Post Office by taking on the pension fund for £9 billion of taxpayers' liability, and then sold it off at a cut price, at a really cheap rate, so quick and easy, for far less than they needed to. The Post, having allowed the Royal Mail to start making profits, they waited for it to start making profits, and then they sold it. So the taxpayers got shortchanged in every possible way, and the way that it was done, with 16, at a gentleman's agreement, getting 16 fund managers getting the prime cut of it all on the basis that they would become long-term stakeholders. What do? They immediately start selling the shares, and their clients making a massive killing at the expense of us. We owned the Post Office in the first place. All of us did. And then they sell it off to people and try and claim it's doing us a favour.
Are you saying this was just a cock-up, or was it motivated? Is there a policy behind it?
Well, a lot of what this government does is a shambles, frankly. But I don't know whether that was the reason here. I just think they were so keen to get rid of it and reward a lot of their mates in the city that they were just prepared to do it, come what may, regardless of the fact that actually we could have built a lot more hospitals and a lot more schools with that money, which have all been cut. And I think that's why I call it an absolute scandal.
All right. Well, Vince Cable, you were in charge of the sale. You're accused of rewarding your mates in the city and of a gentleman's agreement with 16 people who got preferential treatment.
Well, I don't think I have many mates in the city, but leave that on one side. I mean, what we have done is what actually the last government were planning to do. They had committed themselves to bringing in private capital into the Royal Mail, just as we have, and they backed off it because the Communications Workers' Union vetoed it.
You mean they were going to sell a chunk when you say bringing capital?
Well, they were going to privatise it.
No, but actually, still majority public ownership.
That was Peter Mandelson's idea.
Yeah.
That was Peter Mandelson's idea.
I disagree.
What we decided to do, we wanted to put the Royal Mail in a position where it can compete in a very, very intensely competitive market. It was losing its market share. It's faced with furious competition from courier companies, and it has to be able to finance the universal service obligation, which is delivering to every house at the standard rate 6 days a week. So what we determined to do was to sell a majority of shares, some of them to the public, retail, some of them to institutional investors, long-term institutional investors, I'll come to that in a minute, and a substantial chunk also to the workforce, right? That's right. Now, this has become a controversy this week because of the report of the National Audit Office. Their comment, and you could take it as a criticism, but it could be treated as a compliment, is that the government was cautious. It was cautious. And it was cautious for several reasons. The sale took place under the threat of a strike from the Communication Workers' Union. Now, we now know that they were bluffing, but we didn't know at the time, and neither did the investors. So that induced caution into the people who were buying the shares. More important, there was an overhang, there was a memory of lots of other attempts to float shares. Facebook, the most famous brand in the world that had a flop. Their share price had fallen by half when they tried to float a few months earlier. So did the leading mining company Glencore. Previous attempts by governments, different governments, to sell shares, BP, Bristol, had all failed. So the people who did this within my department took the view, on independent financial advice, that they should be cautious. And they consulted about 500 companies as to what the price would be, and we sold at the upper end of that range. Now, of course, the price now is significantly higher. It may stay that way, it may not. If there is a return of industrial relations trouble, it could well be hit badly. If the Royal Mail is unable to compete, and it's a ferocious market, the price could plummet. But it's currently strong.
And you kind of blame the unions for getting the price wrong, because you say
they
bluffed they were going to have a strike, and that meant you had to sell it cheap.
I'm not blaming them. I'm not blaming them at all. It was a fact of life that had to be considered at the time. And I think one of the positive things that's come out of this, instead of having years in which the union were trying to disrupt the work of the Royal Mail, they now own it. They now own a substantial chunk of it.
Why was the National Audit Office so critical then, Vince? Why was it so critical?
They said
the union, it's the National Audit Office.
They said we were cautious. That was the criticism.
They said you were wrong.
They didn't say we were wrong.
They said they could have achieved better value.
Yeah, exactly.
They said we could have. They didn't say we should have. What they said was that there was a risk, had we proceeded at a significantly higher price, that the whole thing could have flopped.
All right, the woman there.
What they did say was that this deep caution was, and the price of which was borne by the taxpayer due to this deep caution.
The caution was borne. What do you make of it, Anthony Ward? You asked the question. What's your view of it?
I think it's very easy to be wise after the event.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
It's notoriously difficult to predict the future values and the price that people will pay for shares. I think it was important to have a successful sale. And if Peter Hain is outraged, perhaps he could tell us why Gordon Brown sold off all our gold reserves at such a very low price.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's a very good point.
You're at the very back there, yes.
I have to say, it really annoys me when you try to make political capital out of these kind of issues. It really does. But in terms of...
who's making political capital?
Peter Hain.
Oh.
You know, he's coming out with huge hindsight.
Sure.
And, you know, where were the arguments at the time?
Sure.
We made the argument.
Can I make a...
No, hold on.
I'm
Julie Bindel.
I think losing, an estimated $1 billion to $1.5 billion from this sale that we could potentially have had, we, the public, it's not cautious, it's reckless. And the public have been shafted once again. But you know what's really obvious to me is that the bankers are laughing all the way back to the bank, because they're the ones, of course, who, through organising this sale, have dragged in millions. And somebody made the point today that politicians make very bad bankers, and I think that's right. But we, the public, have lost out on this, and we know that every time there's one of these big, you know, sellouts of our public amenities, we know that wages are slashed, we know that services are cut down to the bone, and people suffer, and we never get that back. We just have to look at the rail system.
I think...
do you want to answer the point? Really?
No, I think I want to get back to Anthony's point. I mean, it was a very well-made point. You've made more sense than anyone in the floor of the House this week. It's very difficult to get pricing right. If the price had been too high and the thing had flopped, Peter Hain would be on this programme saying the thing was a disaster, the government hadn't done its homework, and that they completely cocked it up. As it was, the government was cautious, the price was low. We had no idea what the market would do in the last 5 or 6 months. News in the economy is getting better, and of course the stock market has done appreciably better. But there was no way we could see that in November, or in October, I think, when the sale happened. And
how much did they go up in the first day, the sale, these shares in value?
20%?
38%?
Was it 38?
38%?
Well, but the point that Anthony makes is true. If the thing had flopped, there would have been a massive inquest and a massive inquiry. Right. Peter Hain and Julie would have been making exactly the same points, but in the reverse.
Peter Hain, you stand accused, first of all, because Gordon Brown sold the gold cheap, so you're no one to talk about it.
That's right.
And secondly, from both sides here, that you're using hindsight.
Look, Gordon sold gold at $280.
Okay, let Peter Hain answer.
I was opposed to the sale That's my point. As
of
a
the
matter
gold
principle,
of Royal Mail?
Of Royal Mail.
Right.
I opposed it when we looked at doing it in a half, as we're selling off half of it. I mean, the other thing that worries me a great deal about this situation, by the way, the postage, the price of a stamp is rocketing, and packets. And that's the way you're going to pay for it twice.
And it's
having been
national
shortchanged by the sale, you're going to actually pay for it. But the thing that worries me most now that it's happened is that I think the Royal Mail should have a fair, level playing field with other competition. A lot of the competitors, like TNT and so on, they do the easy stuff, London to Bristol, and then if it's an outlying village in Somerset or Gloucestershire or somewhere, they just pop it into the Royal Mail to do the hard stuff.
The Royal Mail has an obligation, doesn't it, to do
Royal
6
Mail has an
deliveries
obligation, so they're not competing on a level playing field. They're creaming off the easy, profitable traffic. And I think actually what Vince should do is create a level playing field for all competitors in the Royal Mail.
When you said that, which is a serious accusation, that he was rewarding his mates in the city, or the government was rewarding.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
In what way were they rewarding their mates?
Because
that's what knowingly getting them to take shares which they knew they would then sell on.
I think they were so
ideologically
and dogmatically determined to sell this anyway. They did it, as Julie said, recklessly rather than responsibly, and they were prepared to give their mates in the city a good deal rather than the taxpayers a good deal. That's my point.
The man up there with the check shirt on.
It's a bit worrying that in a few years the government's going to have to sell the banks back, and if it struggles to sell an institution which is worth a couple of billion, how's it going to sell the dozens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions of shares back at a reasonable rate for the taxpayer?
What are you thinking? Same
Potentially.
Same problem?
Potentially.
Camilla Cavendish.
Yeah.
Well, there is an answer to that, I think, which is that you sell more slowly. I mean, I think Anthony's right. You know, it's very easy to be wise after the event. It was incredibly difficult to price because the unions were threatening to strike, so I can see the difficulty. But you didn't have to sell 60%, Vince. You could have sold 25%, you could have seen what the price was going to be, and you could probably do the same with the banks, to your point. You could sort of test the market. And I do think that's where, I mean, the NAO were, you said they paid a compliment. I mean, you know, the NAO was scathing about this sale. And the caution, you know, the problem was you were cautious on price, but you were reckless in how much you sold, and the combination was devastating. But there is an upside. I mean, I think we should remember there is an upside, which is the people who have money in pension funds, who I suppose are what Peter means by the mates in the city, have done quite well out of this because the pension funds all sold at £5.50. And, luckily, the postal workers who bought the shares, thank goodness at least they've got something out of it.
But let's just, Vince, if we can, just go to that point that Camilla made about the report from the National Audit Office saying you should retain 49%. You should have kept for us, the taxpayer, 49%. Why did you go for 30%?
What we had to do was to sell enough to get the thing off the government's borrowing requirements. I mean, that was the problem, because in order for the Royal Mail to survive and compete, it has to borrow in the markets, and it's not going to get the money from the government. And it had, therefore, to be a significant majority of private shares to do that. And that's the advice that we were given.
You didn't sell it all at once, did you?
Yes, but can I just answer the other point? Yeah. I mean, Peter says that somehow or other I should manipulate the amount of competition that is allowed. I'm not allowed to do that. That is set by a regulator, an independent regulator, actually the last government established. They set the rules of competition, I don't.
And you can ask them to change
you know,
the
we're getting this very moralistic lecture on how privatisation be conducted. I mean, one of the models that I had to look at when we decided how to do that was what the Labour government did. When it did its own privatisations, they sold Kinetic, for example, which is a defence company, and after it was sold, the price increased by a factor of 10. That's right. It was 10 times what they sold it for. And that, I mean, I'm not making an ideological point.
How big a company was that?
It was small, considerably smaller than the Royal Mail, but it did illustrate
it wasn't the fundamental public service.
Well,
it wasn't the vital public
service. The fundamental public service
business
is protected because of the way that we now regulate it. The universal service obligation is an obligation that the new Royal Mail has to observe. Yeah, and we've created a position where it can draw capital from the market and compete and meet that social obligation.
Let me hear from one or two other members of the audience. You, sir.
To me, as an ordinary taxpayer, the scandal was that I was only entitled to £275 worth of shares, whereas the big city investors, who would sell them very quickly, were able to have virtually what they wanted. I would have invested and did, in fact, have money set aside up to £10,000 to invest. Luckily, I didn't go over £10,000 because I'd have got absolutely nothing. I think that's where the scandal was.
So it wasn't offered... So it wasn't offered equally to the taxpayer as it was...
Not at all.
And why was that not?
That's a mistake.
Well, if you were able to take up to 10,000, I think most people would consider that a reasonable investment.
He wasn't able
many
to take 10,000.
Many of the institutional investors were not able to invest either because...
Can I correct you?
Private investors, I think, got about £700 max, and you got less. You say 200. Or
yes, well, we put a limit on it because it was oversubscribed, and we wanted, I think, the 700,000 people to have a share. If we'd allocated it all to the very wealthy investors, then small investors would not have had anything.
But the very wealthy investors were the 16 big investors.
They're not wealthy private investors.
They're much wealthier now than they were when they bought the shares.
Let me just describe who they were.
A lot of them are hedge funds.
We're talking about the Legal and General, which has hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of members. We're talking about Royal London. We're talking about classic insurance companies. We're talking about local authority pension funds. Several of them, actually Labour councils in some case, invested their funds in the Royal Mail. These are these wicked financial institutions.
What about the hedge funds?
Well, there are very few hedge funds represented. Right. The one that did buy in has actually disappeared. There's very little hedge fund activity. Most of these are long-term pension funds.
When you say disappeared, you mean cut and run?
They did, yes, actually. Yeah. The people we wanted to sell to were the serious long-term investors who have the Royal Mail's interest at heart. And they're still there. I mean, there is still a substantial majority of shares held by companies of that kind.
A couple more points, then we must go on. You, sir, and then you in the blue shirt. Yeah. Yes, just briefly, if you would.
One thing that sticks in my throat to a certain extent is I was unfortunate enough to go marginally over the limit, and I was eliminated totally because Vince thought I was a spiv or a city speculator, I think were the words. But never mind about that. One thing that does bother me...
It's rather a serious accusation.
Yeah. One thing that does bother me, though, is it now Labour Party policy that the hundreds of thousands of loyal employees, the small shareholders in Royal Mail, and the many, many members of pension funds should not have benefited from this privatisation? Are you now saying that no employee in a company that goes private from the public sector should benefit?
I'm not saying that. No, I'm not saying that at all. I would not have done it in the first place. And since the government was determined to do it, they did it in a reckless way and shortchanged the taxpayer. That's my point.
All right, a brief point from you, sir, in the blue shirt.
The 6 energy companies are all privatised. They're making massive profits. The government are doing actually nothing to protect the working class people from being squeezed right at the root, and they're finding it very difficult to make ends meet. Yeah. Why is privatisation always the best way forward?
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, as ever, you can join in this debate by text or Twitter tonight. Our hashtag BBCQT. You can follow us at BBC Question Time. If you're texting, you can comment at 83981 and the red button will tell you what others are saying. And I'm going on to another question. This one from Oliver Sloan. Oliver Sloan, please.
Is it embarrassing that the Deputy Prime Minister was so outclassed by Nigel Farage in last night's debate on EU membership?
Yes. 27% Nick Clegg won, 68% Nigel Farage won. Vince Cable, he's the leader of your party. What do you say?
I think he deserves a lot of credit for showing the bottle to go out and debate this very difficult issue. And I mean, the people who actually lost were the two party leaders who couldn't be bothered and didn't want to confront the issue. I mean, the fact is that there is a lot of very Eurosceptic feeling in the country. Some of it is rationally based, and some of it's based on myth, and somebody had to go out and confront it.
On that scale, do you think 68 to 27?
You don't know what they were going to vote before the debate started, and we don't know how they would vote in an actual referendum. But no doubt, I mean, Farage, to give him credit, is a very effective, if somewhat demagogic debater, and he scored his points very effectively. We acknowledge that, but I think that merely underlines the extent of the argument that we now have to make. I mean, I spent the day in Bristol talking to manufacturing and other companies, and really underlining to me how many livelihoods in this area depend on the European Union. Airbus and its subsidiary companies, its supply chain companies, are totally dependent on the European Union. And if question marks were put over its future, there would be serious doubts over the many jobs associated with it. I had to answer today, interviewed with your local press, about a survey that the BBC has done in this area, which suggested that of local companies, half of them were wholly committed to the European Union and seriously concerned about the consequences of leaving. About 18% were opposed. I mean, that is the balance of people who are actually providing livelihoods and jobs. And we think in this country about 3.5, 4 million jobs are tied up directly or indirectly with the European Union. And Nick Clegg deserves credit for having taken on this debate and started to try to tackle the myths.
But the argument, of course, is that he took on the debate but lost. You, sir, in the yellow shirt there, and then I come to you over there. Yes.
My question is, does the panel think that the three other major party leaders should have the bottle to debate with Nigel Farage prior to the next general election?
Peter Hain?
Well, I've debated with Nigel Farage on Question Time. And any questions? And, you know, I disagree with him absolutely on a whole number of things, including Europe. And I agree with the points that Vince has made, that for us to consider leaving Europe would be to turn our back on at least 3.5 million jobs dependent on trade with Europe and a whole lot of other benefits that we get. But
so why did Nigel Farage win the debate,
well, I think
according to all the surveys?
Nigel is very good at what he does. He's a normal bloke. I don't think anybody would elect him to be Prime Minister, but he benefits from the enormous anti-politician feeling that there is.
Can I just...
And that's you know, Vince and I and Kwasi, we're disliked as a professional group, frankly. We may not be as individuals, but as a group we're disliked. And Nigel Farage sort of ploughs that seam very, very effectively, and he does it very well. And that's one of the reasons why I think he trounced Nick Clegg last night, not least because Nick Clegg is at the other end of the spectrum of popularity.
Peter, it's not just because politicians are unpopular. It's because Nigel Farage puts his finger on something that a lot of politicians seem unwilling to really talk about, which is that we have an over-centralised, bureaucratic, undemocratic EU, which has actually, because of the euro, made millions of people in Spain and Greece incredibly poor, has not taken responsibility for that, is not taking any action. And you know what I thought? I thought the nadir in the debate last night came when someone in the audience asked, how will the EU look different, I think he said, in 10 years' time? And Nick Clegg's answer was, oh, I think it'll look about the same. And I thought, you know, if you don't understand the urgency of this question, if you don't understand what people are worried about, it doesn't mean that they all want to walk away. And it doesn't mean that they all think Nigel Farage has the answers. But, Peter, if you don't understand, if you are too... If politicians, I don't mean you personally, come across as complacent and not willing to address that issue, then I'm afraid you are going to find that Nigel Farage wins every single time.
I agree with you. I think...
Hold on, Peter.
I'd like to know what the point of these debates are, because whether Nigel wins or anybody else wins the debate, unless the people are actually going to get a referendum and a say in it, what's the point of having a debate?
Agree.
Kwasi?
I think Oliver made a great point. I mean, Nigel Farage won comprehensively that debate. I mean, 68 to 27 is a massive 2-to-1 victory. And as Camilla said, he's definitely hit the popular nerve. And I was, I think, a week old when the referendum happened in 75. And so anyone who is 18 years older than me and younger has never actually had a say on this issue. And there is a huge demand from a large section of people to actually finally deal with this question of the EU. And I think there is a feeling that political elites in Westminster, you know, we're all guys in suits with white shirts and all the rest of it, are completely detached from the people on this issue.
Does that vote suggest to you that's how people would vote in a referendum or not?
No, I don't think so. I think people in Britain are very fair-minded. They will hear the arguments when the referendum happens. But there's certainly a demand to have this debate questioned and to have a say.
Well, if we were to have a referendum tomorrow with the anti-European propaganda that's been fed to us on a daily basis by the likes of the Daily Express, incidentally, it costs us less per day than a copy of the Daily Express to be a member of the EU, then, you know, I would insist upon, surely we all would, proper information being disseminated in an accessible way to the general public about what the benefits are. Why, for example, don't we appoint an independent researcher in to examine what the benefits and what the issues would be, the effect on the economy and on the political system if we left the EU, which I think would be a complete disaster. We don't just make money from the EU. We have millions of jobs. We have a legal system that protects us. And, I mean, in terms of these two men debating, I think that Farage and Clegg actually sounded a little bit like each other. Really? I mean, I really think that if they were... I mean, not in terms of their policies, but it was a little bit of macho posturing. I think if they were at public school together, they might be taking their trousers down to see whose one's biggest. So...
All right. The woman at the very back there. Yes.
What worries me is that when it comes, if and when we get a chance to have a referendum, most people's decision is going to be based on who can come up with the best rhetoric on TV rather than any information that we're not currently being given.
And you in the fourth row, in the check shirt there.
Going back to the actual, rather than talking about the political bickering of whether we should have been in and out, it was more Nick Clegg's actual performance at the debate that was particularly disappointing. The way how he was so patronising to people watching, you know, prefacing things like something called the Lisbon Treaty, as if no one's ever heard of that thing. And I think on one question on, someone asked a question on public services, his answer was, which he picked up on, that's the problem when you have people. Which didn't make any sense. And you tried to get an answer out of him, but he just was completely honest.
And you said in the second, third row. Yeah.
I think Nigel Farage, we should not ignore Nigel Farage because he's riding on what Marine Le Pen is doing in France. Marine Le Pen, she's really riding very high lately. She's been during the May election last Sunday. So the National Front at the moment is riding very high. For me, Nigel Farage is riding on what's happening in France. Okay. So we should keep an eye on that.
And the man in front of you there.
Well, my question really, which nobody's answered, was should there be a debate before the general election which includes Nigel Farage? And no one's answered that. Miliband said today he wouldn't debate Farage in the general election in a leadership debate. Why not? What's he afraid of and what's Cameron afraid of?
Well, no, he's actually said, I think he was talking about the European election.
It was in the Guardian today, in the Guardian about the general election.
No, what he's actually said all along is that it's a matter for the broadcasters, the BBC and others, to determine who should appear. But this is,
not according to the Guardian
from his
today.
point of view, and I think this is the right stance, from his point of view, there are lots of debates that will involve Nigel. I mentioned that I've taken part in a number of them, including on this programme, and that's absolutely right.
But this programme is a discussion programme, it's not a debate in the same way, is it?
The next general election...
Surely the question he's asking is, should Farage be given the standing to stand alongside the Prime Minister, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, and the Labour leader, as an equal?
That's what I'm about to come to. Nigel Farage does not have a Member of Parliament. The Green Party has a Member of Parliament. Should the Green Party's leader be on that platform as well? You're choosing who you want to be the Prime Minister. That'll either be David Cameron or Ed Miliband.
So why isn't Nick Clegg there, then?
Well, because Nick Clegg is in coalition and he had a big bunch of MPs, although much less than the Conservatives and Labour. So, but ultimately, this is a broadcasting matter. There's no question of being afraid to debate. It's saying this is a choice for the country as to who you want to be Prime Minister.
But last week's poll, 15% for UKIP and 9% for the Liberal Democrats.
Okay.
So
Let's just go back to the issue of the debates, and then we'll just move on. You over there on the side.
I don't think that he's really earned his space at the general election debate because so far they're a fringe party that have risen to prominence on one issue, but the general election debate isn't going to be on Europe. I mean, who here can tell you what UKIP's economic policies are? Like, how would they reform the NHS? Like, we don't know those things. So far, they're just the party that are anti-everything. And I think until they actually come up with some credible alternatives, he shouldn't be at a general election debate. He hasn't earned that space yet.
I think you're right. I think that the media has actually dressed him up as some cuddly teddy bear, and that's why he's seen as a man of the people. And we have to remember, he hates the working classes, he hates women, he hates foreigners and immigrants. And this is the Farage that is seen as a man of the people. It's nonsense.
This is just a left-wing...
sorry, you want to come to defend...
This is sort of extreme left... look, I know Nigel Farage, and I don't agree with everything he says, but to demonise him as a sort of National Front,
I
didn't
Marine
say
Le
that.
Pen,
He's in
or
favour,
hater of all
Kwasi. He's
these
in favour
people,
of cutting
is
taxes
absolutely
for the
wrong.
rich. He's in
It's
favour of
absolutely
cutting
wrong.
taxes for the rich and
It's
raising
absolutely
taxes
wrong.
for the rest.
It's-
He wants a flat tax of 31p. that means most taxpayers are going to have a massive tax hike.
But with regard to
under
your
the
issue, in terms of the debates, I've got a very clear view. I think the debate should be a two-person debate between the people who are likely to be the next Prime Minister. I think it should be Ed Miliband and David Cameron. That's my own personal view, because we know that these are the people who are going to be Prime Minister after 2015. I mean, it's a binary choice, as I said earlier. It's a very straight choice, and I think we should have a debate between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition.
No,
leave it
fine.
at that.
Let's go on. We'll leave that for the moment. We'll go on to a question from Tristana Rodriguez, please. Tristana Rodriguez.
Will a monthly £10 membership fee encourage citizens to value the NHS?
This is a proposal made by a former Labour Health Minister, Lord Warner, that everybody should pay £10 a month towards the NHS. And, Tristana, you are a nurse, aren't you, in
Yes,
the NHS?
I'm a community nurse.
You're a community nurse. What do you think of this idea of people paying a £10 on top of their taxes for the NHS?
I mean, I'm wholeheartedly against that, but I do sort of sense in my profession that people are feeling very demoralised, and there's a general feeling that the general public are very complacent about the NHS and don't appreciate it.
Because the new boss of the NHS is on record as saying the NHS has the most sustained budget crunch in its history facing it. Camilla Cavendish, what do you think of the idea?
I think it's very dangerous, but I think there are good reasons for it. So if I can just have a little bit of time, I'll explain why. I think the fact that the NHS is a universal service, free at the point of need, free when you really need it, is really precious, and we shouldn't lose that. And I think if we do lose that, then a whole lot of things slide. And I think... But I also agree with you that I think we have come to take the NHS for granted, and we think of it as free. It's actually not free. We're all paying for it. But because we think of it as free, there are more and more people now who are abusing it, really. And I was talking... A GP rang me yesterday, actually, to complain about something I'd written. He rang me because he had time, because he was sitting through his third missed appointment of the day. And nurses that I've talked to have said to me, why don't we put the price on the medicines? You know, why don't we tell people that the antibiotics that they take home and they can't quite be bothered to finish the course cost 30 quid? And why don't we tell them that the equipment that they take home and don't bring back costs money? And I think you're right. I do think if people were more aware of the real cost of the NHS, they would value it more. I don't think the answer is to slap a £10 charge on it, but I think maybe, and Lord Warner, who made this proposal, he's actually a very thoughtful guy. He's a former Labour Health Secretary. I think there were a lot of other proposals that he made. But I do think we might think about, what do we do when somebody misses an appointment? You know, what do we do when someone rings 999 because they've got it, or they show up to A&E with a sore throat?
What kind of thing can you do? What do you do? Fine them, charge them?
Well, I think there's a lot of doctors and nurses that I've talked to who are now getting to the point where we must not lose the principle of free at the point of need. But we also have to say to people, you know what, if you fail to show up 3 times in a row, there's got to be some kind of price for that. I don't know how you do it, but I do think that we need to put the value back, because otherwise we are going to find that we can't afford the NHS any longer.
All right.
Excuse me.
You, sir.
I would agree with Camilla's point, but I think you should extend that to, for example, when people go out and get completely blottoed on a Saturday night, turn up at an A&E, then they should get an invoice for their, their hotel room for the night. Secondly, I'm a healthy individual and I pay £10 a month. Do I get that back at the end of the year because I haven't used the NHS? Why should I be penalised as a healthy citizen for some people being irresponsible?
You know why? You know why? Because it's a collective... this is about, we need to look after people who've made mistakes, who've fallen on hard times. Maybe you had too many drinks. You can't start charging everybody who's made a mistake or, unfortunately, they've got a particular disease or they've gone out for a drink.
Vince Cable.
As I understand the proposal, that was to £10 per visit to a GP. That was the proposal. And I think this is a seriously bad idea, and I think Camilla's introduction I very much agreed with. I think once you start dismantling the whole principle of free at the point of use, then the edifice starts to crumble. There are practical reasons this is a bad idea. I mean, there are a lot of people for whom £10 is actually quite a lot of money, and some of them have to go regularly, so they don't go, and they don't go until it's too late, and the disease is too late. Other people will try to avoid it by going to the A&E ward, which is already swamped with people, and we're trying to get people into GP surgeries, not into NA wards. And then the argument will be, well, obviously if people are very poor, you've got to let them off. So you create a means test in the GP surgery, and the receptionists who are already swimming in, red tape and all the rest of it are then filling in forms. So it becomes totally self-defeating. I mean, there is a general problem about funding the NHS, and we realise that.
What do you make of the points Camilla made about telling people what things cost, charging them if they don't turn up 3 times running, or finding some way of punishing people for abusing the NHS? That's effectively what you were saying.
It's really trying to demonstrate the value.
Yes. What do you say to that?
Well, there is already charging for certain kinds of medicine. I mean, the mechanisms are there in place. But, I mean, what does punishment actually mean? I mean, how do you know whether somebody's actually used the antibiotics when they've taken it home? I mean, I can understand the frustration of genuine medics when they're dealing with patients who don't take the treatment seriously, but trying to have this kind of policing of the system is just not practical, rather like this proposal.
Peter Hain, you were rather nodding in approval as Camilla was talking.
Well, it rang a bell because I remember a doctor coming to my surgery, as an MP surgery, and saying that a fifth of his appointments don't show. And that's a chronic waste of his resource. It's also terrible because, it's now sometimes people in England have to wait a month to get an appointment with their GP.
Yeah.
And clearly there's something needs to be done about that, whether it's saying if you don't show and you don't provide an explanation, well, then if you ring up next time, you'll be at the back of the queue or whatever it is. But I agree totally with you in what Vince said about you start down the charging road, it'll never end. And you'll hit the people who need it most the hardest. And I'll just make one other point. I think the National Health Service needs better funding. And I think it needs better funding from taxation. And it's the cheapest health provision in the world, much cheaper than America. Because America's private, but actually it costs per capita much, much more than the National Health Service costs us per head of population. We should cherish it. And we should cherish community nurses like you and what you do, and we should support you, not attack you the whole time and denude the whole service of the funding that it needs.
Right. The woman sitting next to the questioner there, yes.
Yes, I'm an ex-nurse, actually, and I would actually agree that it's about time patients were aware of the costs involved, particularly with medication and treatment in hospital. But also, I would actually quite happily pay £10 to see my GP if it meant I could go at the time I wanted and I could get an appointment on the day of my choice.
Right. Julie Bindel.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying, and I do agree with Camilla's points, but I think that would create a two-tiered system where those who can afford the £10 would get the best appointments and those that can't are waiting, and they're often the ones that really are the least advantaged.
I don't think she was quite saying that, were you? You weren't saying you'd pay £10 and get priority.
Yeah. Well, no, it's not about priority. It's about actually getting an appointment when you need an appointment.
Of course. And
it's
I
not
understand.
Priority, is it?
No, well, I absolutely appreciate your point, and I can see why you're making it, because there are times when I've called and I've been told there isn't an appointment for a week, or I have to go in and wait pretty much all day. And when you're busy and working or you've got childcare, it's impossible. But I still think that would, and that's not your intention, set up a two-tiered system where those that can afford to pay for it would get the better appointments, those that aren't in the middle of the day or at the very end of the day, or so early in the morning that you can't do that if you have children. I do think that we appreciate the National Health Service. I do think that we value it. And remember, it's ours. We pay for it. It's not free. We pay for it through our prescription charges, through all other ways, whether we sit on PCTs, whether we volunteer. There are all manner of ways in which we respect our health service, and it should continue. Perhaps it would be a good thing to educate people about the cost of medicines. Maybe it would.
Can I just say, I mean, I've done think tank pieces, and they sometimes get covered, sometimes they don't, and they're very controversial.
What do you mean you've done think tank
Well,
pieces?
I've written think tank pieces, that sort of thing. I mean, I run a
I
thing
don't know
called
what
the
you
Free
mean.
Enterprise.
You run a think tank and
No,
you've written...
I've written for the IEA papers, and they get picked up in the media, and people sometimes criticise. I mean, and what this man is trying to do, yes, it is a controversial thing, but we have to have a mature debate about funding the NHS in the future, in the 2020s and 2030s. People are getting older. The demands on the service are increasing. I mean, if you look at age expectancy, it's gone up 20 years since the NHS was founded in 1947. And clearly, there are going to be more and more costs. And we have to think as a mature and civilised society about how we're going to fund this. I completely agree with Camilla, but I think that to rely on the old methods and simply think we can raise the money through more and more taxation, I think is unrealistic.
The woman there on the left.
So if you take away the appointment system and you're ill and you go to the GP, you won't have anyone sat there waiting for someone to turn up. If you go, you're sick, someone's waiting to serve you when you arrive, as opposed to, oh, I need to book an appointment to see the GP, I'd like to go today, but I can't because the appointment's in 3 weeks' time and I feel a bit better, don't bother to go. And you end up with people then perhaps becoming more unwell because they've got a little better, then became worse.
So you prefer the old system of sitting in the outer waiting room and just taking a turn?
I've lived in Wales, it works there.
In Wales, which doesn't have the best NHS reputation going.
But if you were unwell, you went and sat that day and it works.
Oh, it does have the best reputation.
And the GPs aren't sat there waiting.
It's got a good reputation.
When we're in Wales, everybody complains about the NHS like anything.
When I'm in England, everybody complains about the NHS. I have an elderly relative who's just been discharged after a very serious operation, who has not yet seen her GP after being a month out of a hospital and is supposed to get care in the community. It just doesn't exist.
Okay, you, sir.
Yeah. Before I retired, I worked for many years as a project surveyor in hospitals. And I agree that the clinical costs are horrendously high, but like all large institutions, there's a mindset where it's spending other people's money. They really don't care. They think in telephone numbers. I worked in one hospital, for instance, where they just completed a whole new maternity complex. The doctor who laid the brief out realised he hadn't put in a recovery room for the theatres. So they ripped half of the whole project out again.
But your point is that these big institutions always waste money, in effect?
One hospital I worked in, the only time that it was cured, each department was given its own budget, and it wasn't allowed to step outside that, and that brought the cost right down.
Okay.
When people realised how much money they were spending.
So, and do you think if clients of the NHS realised how expensive it was, it would make a difference? I go to the woman up there at the back on the right, if I can. Yes.
I think we should resist all attempts to start charging people to see their GPs, because the only ones that are going to lose out by this are the most vulnerable, which is the very reason the NHS was set up in the first place.
Okay. Let's go back to domestic politics for a moment. Adrian Mays. Adrian Mays, please. Yes.
If Maria, the minister who was unable to reconcile her expenses this week herself, why should she keep her job?
Maria Miller, the Culture Secretary, yes, who had to apologise to the House of Commons today. Why should she keep her job if she can't get her expenses right? Julie Bindel.
Well, obviously, we've heard a lot over the last few years about whether it's expense overclaiming, expense fiddling, and I'm really grateful that we've been informed in detail about the fact that so many serving members of Parliament are scamming. But there are many who are not. And I think it is disgraceful what she's done, and I think that the fact that she seems to have committed an act of fraud, whether it's criminal or not, rather than made a mistake, which definitely had happened with some of the cases. You know, it is a real scandal, and I think that the apologies that we're hearing over and over again are just getting a little banal. So I want to see real accountability with all public servants. Whether or not she's committed, you know, a worse crime, if you like, than others, I don't know. But certainly it's reopened the debate, and I can imagine that there'll be others following her.
Mm-hmm. Peter Hain, of course, you resigned as a minister, didn't you, over a failure to declare
Yeah, but it was nothing to do with my parliamentary
No,
experience.
no, but you've been...
It was to do with not declaring donations to a deputy leader campaign within the time limit.
Yes.
I went over the time limit. When I discovered the problem, I reported it, and I was then, as it were, attacked and traduced, and I just thought the best thing to do is resign. I did, cleared my name, and I went back to the Cabinet.
Do you think Maria Miller should do the same?
Well, I think that it seems to be that some MPs were treated in one way, and she seems to have been treated in another way. I think that's the problem here. But what's also the problem is this is actually a hangover from the old system. The new system that has operated since the last general election is extremely rigorous, is very, very clearly policed, and you simply can't do the kind of thing that brought us all into disrepute. That minority of MPs basically did more to destroy trust between the voters and politicians like me than almost anything else that's happened in the last few generations. And they deserve every attack that they get. But it's been a terrible experience.
In what way has she been treated differently from others?
Well, I can just think of Labour colleagues. Some of us have served prison sentences.
They did illegal things.
Well, they did, but,
and they were convicted.
Look, I'm not going to have a go at Maria Miller. I'm just simply making the point that I think she's been treated very leniently compared with the way others have been treated.
But, I mean, let's get this straight.
The public have an enormous contempt for politicians who scam their expenses. That's what I think.
I think you're right. I think there is a problem clearly with expenses, but we have the rule of law in Britain, and if you break the law, there's a judicial process, and people who broke the law, colleagues of ours, have been sent to jail, and they've done their time.
Yeah.
There's no indication, there's no sign, or no one is suggesting that Maria broke the law. She was accused of something, I think it was John Mann, one of our parliamentary colleagues on the Labour side. And the investigation, actually, on John Mann, what he said, I understand that she was exonerated. So, but there was, she apologised fully. People said the apology could have been longer. But I think, as it stands, she should be allowed to continue in her job.
But the Immigration Minister, Mark Harper, he resigned just because he didn't know whether his cleaner had a...
Yes, I mean, that was very... I think that was very harsh, but at the same time...
He was the
immigration minister. But he was the immigration minister. I mean, you know, there is there was a peculiar sensitivity about that, given the fact that he was the immigration minister employing an illegal immigrant. There was a paradox, David, to that.
So you thought his resignation
and he
was
did the right
proper.
thing. I mean, he wasn't forced to do it. He behaved very honourably and handed in his resignation.
Vince Cable.
Well, I worry when I hear people bandying around words like fraud in a sort of rather casual way. I mean, there obviously is a distinction between fraud and cheating and scams on the one hand and mistakes on the other. Now, I don't know the details of this case, but the people who investigated it, there is a parliamentary standards group, people from each of the different parties represented on it, who looked at this case and came to the conclusion on the facts that she was not involved in deliberate deception, but that there had been a mistake. And
Why did she have to apologise then?
Well, she apologised for making a serious mistake, and she's repaid the money. But there was a proper process. I mean, had she been involved in anything dishonest, and had the Standards Committee found that, and of course she'd have had to go, and she would have had to face probably police action.
Criminal
as some of our colleagues would. But there was a very clear distinction, and say an independent body established that there was no fraud in this case.
Her apology was for the way that she handled the Commissioner's inquiries. It wasn't
yes,
for the act
and that's
itself.
the point, David. I mean, I think what I find depressing about this, I don't know the details, and she obviously was exonerated, but what I did read was that the inquiry had found that she was uncooperative. And that's what depresses me about this. You know, she may have been above board, it may have been fine, but, you know, you have to... You have to have the grace as a public servant to treat these inquiries seriously.
Sure.
The woman there shouted out then, just then.
Yes, the apology was for obstructing the investigation. That was what she was apologising for. So what does that say about her character? You know, should she really be...
What do you think? Do you think she should have resigned?
Yeah. Yes, I do.
Also, yes, on the left there on the gangway. I want to get people who haven't spoken yet. Yes.
She should have been sacked. This is very black and white. At the end of the day, take law take law out of the equation. She's an MP, and there is a moral grounds here for her to be sacked. There's one thing to make a mistake over a couple of months. This was over a prolonged period of time. She claimed for interest that she wasn't being charged. I work in the private sector. If I made mistakes on my expenses every month, I would be sacked.
Kwasi, you're a colleague of hers in the same party. Just briefly answer that point, because I want to go on to another question.
I think she's a very capable minister. I think there is a case for saying I think she's doing a very good job. I think she's doing...
She is in a moral position. She's an MP. She's voted in. She should be sacked. She has a grounds to live up to. And going to say that the rules that she was living with at the time mean that she didn't have to live up to a certain code is irrelevant as well. She is in a role, she has a moral code to live up to, and she failed that, and she failed the public.
I'm afraid... Look, I know passions are very strong here, but I'm afraid I disagree with you. I don't think that... there was an independent inquiry. That exonerated her. Other colleagues of mine have faced criminal charges, and they've been convicted, and they've been sent down to court, sent down to jail. And I don't think that this is a resigning...
Last point from you, sir, in the tie there.
Kwasi, you can't say that, because ultimately what this is about is the three of you telling us you're whiter than white. Simple as that. I'm a civil servant. If I did that, I would be sacked.
Also, Peter Hain... Sorry, we must leave this, but you're saying he's right, and she should resign.
I'm not saying whether she'd resign or she should have been sacked. That's a matter for others.
What's
but
he right
I'm saying
about?
he's right to say that when politicians don't pay the price when something like this happens, it brings us into even more contempt.
The real cost of democracy's real cost.
OK. Let's go on to another question. We've got time for one more. Joseph Llewellyn has it, please. Joseph Llewellyn.
Is it a good idea for children to start school at age 2, or should they be allowed to be children for a little longer?
A good idea for children to start school at the age of 2. Ofsted's boss, Sir Michael Wishaw, was suggesting this today, that children should start their schooling at the age of 2. Camilla Cavendish, what do you think of that proposal?
Well, I have 3 quite small children. So I don't know how you would answer the question, but I suspect from the way you're asking it, you think children should be allowed to be children for a bit.
Well, ask him, he'll tell you. Where are you?
Well, yes, why don't you tell us first, and then I'll tell you what I think.
I think being a child, being allowed to run around and play is a massively important part of growing up, and to make them start school at age 2 just doesn't make sense to me. I've recently come out of school, and I've had 5 years of continuous exams, and to be honest, it's been horrible. I've hated it.
Just to give the context, what Wishaw said was that more than 2/3... He stressed this, of our poorest children. In some of our poorest communities, that goes up to 8 children out of 10, go to school unprepared. They can't hold a pen, they have poor language and communication skills, they don't recognise simple numbers, and they can't use the toilet independently, and so on. So it seems to be that he's aiming at, and including everybody in it.
Exactly. The point is what you mean by school. And I have a lot of time for Michael Wilshaw. He did brilliant work when he was a head teacher in Hackney, and what he did for really disadvantaged kids who until then had had no hope was extraordinary. So he is, I think, genuinely concerned about that group of children that you're talking about, David, who clearly are not getting the kind of learning that they need, which is pretty basic at that age. I don't think he's suggesting that they should all sit down at tables and recite their times tables. I mean, which would be completely ludicrous. I sit on Frank Field's Early Years Foundation Trust, and one of the things that we're looking at is the huge disadvantage that kids from certain backgrounds start with at the age of 5. And, you know, you can't make up for that later. All the studies now show if you arrive at school without those basic things, without your basic vocabulary, you are so far behind. You're getting overtaken so quickly by children who have a better home life and who have parents who provide those things. Yeah. So I think that it's absolutely vital. It's absolutely vital for social mobility that we look seriously at that group of children. But it's equally vital that if we want to send them all back to school, whatever we mean by that, we have to have absolutely top quality people doing that job. All right. Because I think just sort of sticking them in some kind of factory around a desk certainly isn't going to work.
OK, Julie Bindel.
Yes, definitely I would suggest that as a really good way forward. It would benefit parents, it would particularly benefit single parents, in the main single mothers. and those working class children that don't have a house full of books, parents that have the time to engage with them because of the stress of living on benefits below the poverty line, working 3 jobs, for whatever reason. You know, the rich kids, the kids from middle class backgrounds, wealthier backgrounds, should go to school with those kids from lower social groups, because it's a brilliant equaliser, and I think that it would be amazing for children to start mixing together across class and races and cultures at such a young age, before prejudices set in and before disadvantages set in.
Kwasi Kwarteng, what do you make of the point about should we allow them to be children for a little bit longer?
No, I would accept that, because of course the way in which society has evolved is that the schools for 2-year-olds wouldn't be fully comprehensive in the way that you describe. Because there are lots of different, you know, I'm sure richer people would probably pay to send their children at that age to private schools.
If we had a proper comprehensive system and abolished the private school system,
then maybe
it would.
Yeah, but no one is suggesting that.
But Tim Loughton, who's the former children's minister, said today, what next? He said, SATS test for embryos?
No,
in other words, he's very scathing about it.
I think that's... I mean, Tim has his own way of expressing himself, but I think he makes a good point. I don't think
he does make a good point.
I think he does make a good point. I don't think 2-year-old children should go to school.
But hang on, let me just tell you, I just get to the bottom of this. What Wilshaw said was, let's not pander to those who think children's childhoods are being stolen. It's a middle-class prejudice for which some of the most disadvantaged pay the price.
But there is a huge... I agree that there are huge social problems that we face as a society, and there is massive inequality that we face. But I don't think that that's solved. I don't think that's solved by forcing every 2-year-old to go to school.
Right,
I don't think that's... We should be addressing social causes,
but
not trying to force everyone to go to school.
We've only got a couple of minutes, Peter, if you could...
The problem is, I speak to teachers in nursery and reception classes, and some even in the first year of primary school. The kids come not even being able to go to the toilet. Not even being able to hold knives and forks, let alone read a book, because that's... not just for the reasons Julie says, which are valid in terms of very poor parents. Actually, parents need to take their responsibilities properly. I speak as a parent and I speak as a grandparent.
But you're right.
And one of the things we have to do, otherwise we're creating an enormous problem that stacks up for schools when they get into school, unless we deal with the problem as...
This isn't about sending...
Last word to you.
I mean, this isn't or shouldn't be about sending 2-year-olds to formal school. There are some very good educational systems in Northern Europe where people don't start to 6 or 7. The issue is, and I think several of the panellists identified, which is this enormous gulf where, you know, by 5 or 6, you can predict how children will succeed or fail. And somehow or other one has to counter that disadvantage. And what my side of the coalition has done in the government is introduce something called a pupil premium, which applies in school, but also applies to preschool. It also applies to preschool and helps with things like, you know, breakfasts or helping in nursery schools and helping those children, you know, between 2 and 5 to get up to a reasonably equal level playing field when they're at school.
So you agree with the proposal?
I agree with the proposal of helping young children, but not, as Camilla said, it's not sitting 2-year-olds in formal classroom setting. That's not the issue. It's giving people from disadvantaged backgrounds proper help, proper support, so that when they do go to school, they're there on a level playing field.
We must stop, I'm afraid. Our time's up. Next week, we're going to be in West London. Harriet Harman will be among the politicians on the panel. The businessman Sir Martin Sorrell will be there, and Billy Bragg, the musician and campaigner. We then have to take a break over Easter when Parliament's in recess, but we're back on the 1st of May in Leeds. So just to make a note, next week we'll be in West London and in Leeds 3 weeks away. If you'd like to come to either programme, as I always say, if you can read it on your television, the address is there. And the telephone number, 0330 123 9988. So do apply. If you're listening on 5 Live, of course, this debate goes on. But as far as Bristol's concerned, this debate comes to a halt. My thanks to all of you on the panel. And thanks to you, the audience here. Until next Thursday from Question Time. Good night.
The Pressures of looking good next as Angela Rippon and, never seen without her makeup, Miss Piggy join this week next on BBC One.